The iron shackles rattled against the wooden platform as the crowd gathered in the dusty square of Redemption Falls, their laughter cutting through the scorching afternoon heat like broken glass. The year was 1878, and the town had seen plenty of spectacles, but nothing quite like the sight of the enormous man being hauled onto the auction block like livestock. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broader than a barn door, muscles rippling beneath sun-darkened skin, marked with scars that told stories of violence and survival. His black hair hung wild and tangled past his shoulders, and his eyes, those eyes burned with something that made even the boldest men step back. They called him Savage, though no one knew his real name, and he'd been captured 3 months prior, after living alone in the mountains like a creature from frontier legends. Eleanor Hartwell stood at the edge of the crowd, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the dusty browns and faded blues worn by the townspeople around her. Her fingers clutched a lace handkerchief that had belonged to her late husband, Charles, who died 6 months earlier from fever, leaving her with a sprawling ranch she couldn't manage alone and debts that threatened to swallow everything she'd built. At 32, she was considered past her prime by the gossiping ladies of Redemption Falls. But Eleanor carried herself with the dignity her Boston upbringing had instilled, even as circumstances had dragged her west into this harsh land. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her green eyes, eyes that had once sparkled with hope, now held a weariness that came from too many sleepless nights worrying about survival. Please subscribe to this channel, and let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more stories from the Old West to life. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man named Silas Morton, cracked his whip against the platform, making the chained man flinch, not from fear, but from pure instinct, like a wolf testing the strength of a trap. Gentlemen, ladies, what am I bid for this magnificent specimen? Strong as an ox, wild as the wind, but broken enough to be useful. Perfect for mining, logging, or any labor too dangerous for civilized men. The crowd erupted in jeers and catcalls, some throwing rotten vegetables at the platform. $5, someone shouted, followed by cruel laughter. Hell, I wouldn't pay 5 cents for that animal, another voice called out. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Anger, perhaps, or something deeper, something that reminded her of the wounded hawk she'd once nursed back to health on her father's estate in Massachusetts. The man they called Savage didn't respond to the taunts. He stood perfectly still, his jaw set in a hard line. But Eleanor noticed the way his massive hands clenched and unclenched within the iron manacles. Noticed the barely perceptible tremor in his shoulders that spoke of contained fury. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of wild horses her husband had tried to break with whips and spurs, horses that eventually died rather than submit. Something in that recognition stirred her, made her remember a time before Charles, before the West, when she'd believed people deserved dignity regardless of their circumstances. Her father, a Boston physician who treated rich and poor alike, had taught her that strength wasn't always loud, that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was extend compassion where none was expected. $10. A barrel-chested rancher named Dutch Williams stepped forward, his tobacco-stained teeth visible through a cruel grin. I got mine shafts that need clearing, and if he dies down there, ain't no loss to anyone. The crowd laughed harder, and Eleanor saw the way Dutch's hand rested on the bullwhip, coiled at his belt. She knew Dutch Williams's reputation. 3 men had died working his claims in the past 2 years, and everyone knew he worked his laborers until they dropped. The thought of this man, whoever he really was, ending up in Dutch's hands, made something fierce rise up in Eleanor's chest. Something she thought had died along with her husband and her dreams of making a real home in this unforgiving territory. Without thinking, without planning, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the jeers like a knife. $100. The square fell silent. Every head turned toward her, expressions ranging from shock to outrage to crude amusement. Silas Morton's eyes widened with greedy surprise, while Dutch Williams' face darkened with anger. "Mrs. Hartwell," the auctioneer stammered, "perhaps you don't understand what you're bidding on here. This ain't some ranch hand. This is a dangerous man, barely tamed. He's killed before." "I understand perfectly, Mr. Morton," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. $100. Do I hear any other bids? She met Dutch Williams' glare without flinching, though her knees felt weak beneath her skirts. For the first time since being dragged onto the platform, the chained man's eyes found hers. Eleanor felt the impact of that gaze like a physical force. There was intelligence there, burning beneath the wild exterior, and something else she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, exactly, but recognition, as if he understood that she'd just done something that went beyond mere purchase. "Going once," Silas called out, his voice uncertain as he glanced at Dutch Williams, who looked ready to challenge the bid with his fists rather than his wallet. "Going twice." The tension in the square was thick enough to cut, and Eleanor could hear the whispers starting already. The scandalized gasps from the church ladies, the crude suggestions from the saloon crowd. "Sold to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to seal something irrevocable. Eleanor paid in banknotes that represented the last of her savings, money she'd planned to use for seed and supplies for the coming winter. As the money changed hands, she wondered if she'd lost her mind, if the loneliness and desperation of the past months had finally broken something essential inside her. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Bradshaw, who'd served with her late husband in the war, approached with the keys to the shackles. "Eleanor, you sure about this? This man's dangerous. We found him living in a cave up in the Black Ridge, killed a grizzly with his bare hands. There's stories he was with the Cheyenne for years, went completely feral." Sheriff Bradshaw's concern was genuine, but Eleanor had made her choice. "Unlock him, Tom," she said quietly, "and give me the key." The sheriff hesitated, but eventually complied, though he kept his hand on his gun as he approached the platform. The crowd had backed up considerably, giving the chained man a wide berth as if his wildness might be contagious. As the iron fell away from those powerful wrists, leaving deep grooves in the skin, the man, savage, though Eleanor refused to think of him that way, didn't run or attack as many had expected. He simply stood there, rolling his shoulders, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. There was a question in that gaze, one she didn't yet know how to answer. She'd just purchased a man's freedom, or perhaps his servitude, and neither option sat well with her Boston-bred sensibilities. But as she looked at him, really looked past the wild hair and fearsome appearance, she saw something that resonated with her own desperate situation, a soul fighting for survival in a world that had no place for him. "Come with me," Eleanor said, her voice softer now, meant only for him. "I have a wagon." She turned and walked toward the edge of the square, where her buckboard waited, not looking back to see if he would follow. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of bare feet on packed earth, heard the muttering of the crowd, heard Dutch Williams spit and curse. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hartwell," someone called out. "That savage'll murder you in your sleep." But Eleanor kept walking, her spine straight, her head held high, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd just spent her last $100 on a man she didn't know, based on nothing but an instinct she couldn't explain, and a bone-deep certainty that leaving him to Dutch Williams would have been a greater mistake than anything she might face in the days ahead. The road from Redemption Falls to the Hartwell Ranch stretched 15 miles through rolling prairie grassland that had turned golden brown in the late summer heat, with the jagged peaks of the Black Ridge Mountains rising purple and ominous in the distance. Eleanor drove the wagon in silence, acutely aware of the massive presence sitting in the back bed, not speaking, not even shifting much, just watching the landscape pass, with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. The buckboard creaked and rattled over the rutted trail, and Eleanor's hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. What had she done? What would the ranch hands say when she arrived with this man? What would she even do with him? She'd acted on pure impulse, something completely unlike her normally careful nature. The man they called Savage had said nothing since leaving town, but Eleanor could feel the weight of his attention, could sense him studying her the way a wild animal studies something it doesn't yet understand. She knew the stories that circulated about him, that he'd been found living in a cave system in the Black Ridge, that he'd survived alone through 2 brutal winters, that he'd fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a knife and his bare hands. The marshal who'd captured him had said he didn't speak English, or pretended not to, and had fought like a demon until they'd knocked him unconscious and brought him down in chains. But Eleanor had seen intelligence in those dark eyes, had seen something more than animal instinct in the way he'd looked at her in that square. As they crested a rise, the Hartwell Ranch came into view, or what remained of it. The main house, a 2-story structure with a wide porch, still stood proud against the sky. But Eleanor could see the peeling paint, the missing shingles, the general air of neglect that 6 months without Charles had brought. The barn needed repairs. Several sections of fence had fallen, and the corral stood empty except for her 3 remaining horses. What had once been a thriving cattle operation now looked like the bones of a dream, picked clean by circumstances. Eleanor felt shame wash over her. Shame that this stranger would see how far she'd fallen, how little she had left to show for all the years of hard work and sacrifice. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the barn, taking a deep breath before turning to face her passenger. "I'm going to be honest with you," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I don't know why I bought you today. I don't know what I'm going to do with you, and I certainly don't have money to pay you wages. But I do know that Dutch Williams would have worked you to death in his mines, and I couldn't stand by and watch that happen." She paused, searching his face for any reaction. "So here's what I'm offering. Work for me, help me save this ranch, and in return, I'll give you food, shelter, and your freedom. No chains, no beatings, just honest work and fair treatment. When winter comes, if you want to leave, you can leave. Do you understand?" For a long moment, the man simply stared at her, and Eleanor began to wonder if the stories were true, if he really couldn't understand English. Then, in a voice roughened by disuse, but unmistakably intelligent, he spoke. "I understand." The words were simple, but they hit Eleanor with unexpected force. "Good," she managed, trying not to show her surprise. "What's your real name? I won't call you Savage." His jaw tightened, as if the question pained him. "Name don't matter. Been alone too long. Forgot what it sounds like." Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, some wall she'd carefully constructed, crumbling at the raw honesty in those words. "Then we'll have to find you a new one," she said softly. Before either could say more, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders came around the side of the house. Her ranch hands, or what remained of them. Pete Williams, Dutch's younger brother, sat on a paint horse, flanked by 2 men Eleanor had hired just a month earlier. Pete's face was twisted with barely concealed contempt as he took in the scene. "Well, well, Mrs. Hartwell. Heard you made quite a purchase in town. That true? You bring that Savage back to our ranch?" The possessive way he said "our" made Eleanor's blood boil. Pete had been Charles's friend, and she'd kept him on out of loyalty. But his attitude had been growing more insolent by the week, especially after Charles's death. "My ranch, Pete," Eleanor corrected, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster. "And yes, I've hired someone to help with the heavy work." She noticed how Pete's hand had moved to rest on his gun, noticed how the other 2 men, Jake Murphy and Red Callahan, had spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. "That so? Well, me and the boys been talking, and we ain't comfortable working alongside no wild man. Ain't safe, ain't proper neither, you being a widow woman alone out here." Pete's voice carried a threat that made Eleanor's stomach clench. "If you're uncomfortable with my decisions, Pete, you're welcome to collect your pay and leave." Eleanor stood her ground, though she could feel her knees shaking. Pete's laugh was cruel and dismissive. "That ain't how this is going to work, Eleanor." He dropped the respectful Mrs. Hartwell deliberately, an insult that didn't go unnoticed. "You got no money to pay us anyway. Everyone knows that. This ranch is going under, and when it does, my brother Dutch is ready to buy it for pennies on the dollar. Might as well save yourself the trouble and sell now." He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes running over Eleanor in a way that made her skin crawl. "Or you could consider other arrangements. A woman in your position needs protection, needs a man to make decisions. I'd be willing to—" The rest of Pete's words were cut off by a blur of motion, as the man from the wagon moved faster than anyone that size should have been able to move. One moment, Pete was in his saddle, leering and threatening. The next, he was flat on his back in the dust, the giant's hand wrapped around his throat, the other hand having caught Pete's gun before it could clear leather. Jake and Red had drawn their weapons, but the wild man had positioned himself so that Pete's body shielded him, and any shot they took would risk hitting their companion. "Don't," Eleanor commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. "All of you, don't." She approached carefully, aware that she was walking into a situation that could turn deadly in an instant. "Let him go," she said to the man whose name she still didn't know. "He's not worth it." Those dark eyes found hers, questioning, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might ignore her. Then, slowly, the massive hand released its grip on Pete's throat. Pete scrambled backward, coughing and gasping, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "You're dead," he spat, reaching for a second gun. "Both of you are dead." But before he could draw, Sheriff Bradshaw's voice rang out from behind them. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Pete." The sheriff had ridden up unnoticed during the confrontation, and his Winchester was pointed casually but deliberately at Pete Williams. Now, seems to me, Mrs. Hartwell made herself clear. You boys can take your pay and ride out, or you can settle down and do the jobs you were hired for. But you ain't gonna threaten a widow woman on her own land, and you sure ain't gonna start a gunfight in my county. We clear? Tom Bradshaw's presence had shifted the dynamic entirely, and Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude she'd never adequately be able to express. Pete gathered himself slowly, his eyes promising future violence, even as his voice took on a false reasonableness. Clear, Sheriff. We was just leaving anyway. Ain't staying on a ranch run by a fool woman who brings in wild animals instead of honest workers. He mounted his horse, with Jake and Red following suit. You got 3 days, Eleanor. 3 days to reconsider before my brother Dutch comes calling about purchasing this property. After that, well, accidents happen on ranches. Fires, stampedes, all kinds of unfortunate things. He spurred his horse hard, galloping away with the other two in a cloud of dust that hung in the golden afternoon light like a lingering threat. After they'd gone, Sheriff Bradshaw dismounted, eyeing the big man who stood perfectly still near the wagon, his expression unreadable. Eleanor, you got any idea what you just done? Dutch Williams ain't a man to cross, and now you've made an enemy of him and his whole crew. Tom's voice carried genuine worry. I didn't have a choice, Tom, Eleanor replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Pete was going to force me off my land, one way or another. At least now I have someone here who can help me defend it. She glanced at the man who'd just choked Pete Williams with one hand, wondering if she was trying to convince the sheriff or herself. Besides, you saw what happened. He could have killed Pete, but didn't. That shows control, doesn't it? The sheriff looked skeptical, but he couldn't argue with the logic. Maybe so, but Eleanor, you need to understand. This man, whatever his story is, he's been living like a wild thing in those mountains for God knows how long. You can't predict what he'll do. Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. And you being alone out here with him, it ain't gonna look right to folks in town. Your reputation. My reputation is already ruined, Tom, Eleanor interrupted, her voice heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. I'm a woman trying to run a ranch alone. Half the town thinks I should sell to Dutch and move back east. The other half thinks I should remarry immediately. Nobody thinks I can manage on my own. So what difference does it make now? She straightened her shoulders, meeting the sheriff's concerned gaze with determination. I appreciate your concern, truly, but this is my choice to make. Sheriff Bradshaw sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression Charles used to get when he'd made up his mind about something. All right, Eleanor, it's your ranch, your life, but I'm gonna be checking in regular-like. And if anything seems wrong, if you need help, you send word immediately. Understood? He tipped his hat to her, then fixed the big man with a hard stare. And you, I don't know your story, but you lay one hand on Mrs. Hartwell in anything but defense of this property, and I'll hunt you down personally. We clear? The man nodded once, a slight movement that somehow conveyed more respect than words could have. Tom mounted his horse and rode off toward town, leaving Eleanor alone with her impulsive purchase and the consequences she'd have to live with. The silence that followed the sheriff's departure felt heavier than before, weighted with unspoken questions and uncertain futures. Eleanor turned to face the man fully, studying him in the amber light of the setting sun. Up close, away from the jeering crowd and immediate danger, She could see details she'd missed before. The way his face, beneath the wild hair and beard, held a certain weathered handsomeness. The intelligence that burned in those dark eyes. The scars that crisscrossed his arms and chest, each one a story of survival. "Are you hungry?" she asked, because in her world, the world her mother had raised her in, you fed people before you asked difficult questions. "There's food in the house. Not much, but enough." The man's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, answering the question more honestly than words could have. And Eleanor caught the faintest ghost of what might have been embarrassment crossing his features. It made him seem more human, less the creature the townspeople believed him to be. She led him toward the house, acutely aware of how strange this situation was. A proper Boston-bred widow bringing a man who'd lived wild in the mountains into her home. A man she'd purchased for $100 she couldn't afford. A man whose real name she still didn't know. The porch steps creaked under their combined weight, and Eleanor pushed open the front door, revealing a home that had once been filled with hope and laughter, but now felt hollow and tired. The main room held a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, and a dining table had seen better days. Family photographs lined the mantel. Her wedding day, Charles in his army uniform, her parents back in Massachusetts. The man stopped at the threshold, seeming uncertain whether to enter, and Eleanor realized with a start that this moment mattered, that what happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. "Come in," she said gently, the way she might speak to a frightened animal. "This is your home now, for as long as you choose to stay." She watched him take that first step across the threshold, saw the way his eyes darted around the room, cataloging exits and potential threats, never fully relaxing. Eleanor moved toward the kitchen, needing something to do with her hands, needing to process the enormity of what she'd done. "I'll heat up some stew. It's left over from yesterday, but it's still good." She busied herself with the stove, aware of him standing in the middle of the room, too large for the space. His presence filling every corner. The kettle whistled, breaking the tension slightly, and Eleanor focused on the familiar ritual of preparing food, taking comfort in the normalcy of it, even as everything else about this day had been completely insane. As the stew warmed, she set out 2 bowls, 2 spoons, bread that was only slightly stale. "Sit," she invited, gesturing to the table. After a moment's hesitation, he did, moving with surprising grace for someone his size, though his knees barely fit under the table. Eleanor served him first, a generous portion that represented more than she should probably spare, then a smaller amount for herself. They ate in silence. The only sounds, the scrape of spoons against bowls and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She caught herself watching him, noting how he ate with controlled intensity, not the mindless gobbling of someone starved, but the careful consumption of someone who'd learned not to waste food, who didn't know when the next meal might come. When he'd finished, she served him more without being asked, and he nodded his thanks, something almost like surprise flickering across his features. Finally, when the meal was done and the dishes cleared, Eleanor poured them each a cup of coffee, real coffee, another luxury she probably shouldn't be indulging in, and sat across from him at the table. "I need to know your story," she said quietly. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to know something. The marshal said they found you in the Black Ridge, said you'd been living wild, but you speak English. You understand everything I say. So who are you? Where did you come from?" She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, waiting, not pushing, giving him space to decide how much to share. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might not answer at all. Then, slowly, haltingly, as if the words were rusty from disuse, he began to speak. "Had another life," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Before, was called Samuel. Samuel Bridger. Worked as a scout, guide for wagon trains coming west. Had a woman, had a daughter." He paused, his jaw clenching. 5 years back, brought a train through Cheyenne territory. Promised safe passage. Paid the tolls. Did everything right. But there was men on that train. Miners didn't respect the agreements. Killed a Cheyenne chief's son over nothing, over a insult. His hands tightened around the coffee cup, and Eleanor feared it might shatter. Cheyenne came for revenge. Killed those miners, but killed others too. My woman, my daughter. They were 8 and 32. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Eleanor could hear the ocean of pain beneath that careful control. "I went crazy," Samuel continued, his eyes fixed on something distant that Eleanor couldn't see. "Rode into Cheyenne camp alone, planning to die killing as many as I could. But the chief, old man named Bearheart, he stopped his warriors. Said I'd already been punished enough. Said rage like mine would burn me from inside if I didn't let it go." He finally met Eleanor's eyes, and she saw the haunted depths there. "Couldn't go back to civilization. Couldn't be around people who'd look at me with pity or fear. So I went to the mountains, built a shelter, hunted, survived. Thought maybe the wild would take me eventually, that I'd die fighting a bear or fall off a cliff. Didn't happen. Just kept surviving, day after day after day, until I couldn't remember why I'd wanted to die in the first place. Until I couldn't remember much of anything except eating and sleeping and existing." Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. She understood now, understood the wildness that had overtaken him, understood the man beneath the savage appearance. "How did they catch you?" she asked softly. Samuel's lip curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Got careless. Was tracking an elk. Didn't notice the posse until they had me surrounded. Marshall Thompson, he knew who I was. Recognized me from before. Said I'd be hanged if they brought me in for killing that grizzly on Hartwell land." He paused, realization dawning. "Your land, your husband's land. I killed a bear that was taking cattle. Didn't know, didn't mean." "It's all right," Eleanor interrupted. "Charles wouldn't have hung you for protecting livestock. But Marshall Thompson wanted the reward Dutch Williams was offering, didn't he? For a dangerous criminal they could auction off as labor?" "Smart woman," Samuel said, and there was approval in his voice. "Dutch Williams controls the marshal, controls the mayor, controls half the county. When they brought me to town, Thompson made sure Dutch knew, made sure it got arranged as an auction instead of a trial. Would have worked too, except I have a terrible habit of making impulsive decisions when I see injustice," Eleanor finished. She sipped her coffee, thinking about the strange series of events that had brought them both to this moment. Samuel Bridger. That's a good name. Better than Savage, anyway. She straightened her shoulders, making a decision. "Here's what I propose. You help me save this ranch, help me fix what's broken. And when spring comes, if you want to go back to the mountains, I won't stop you. But maybe, just maybe, you'll find a reason to stay. Maybe we both will." Samuel studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt the weight of that assessment, felt him measuring her in ways she didn't fully understand. "Why?" he finally asked. Why spend everything you had on a stranger? Why risk your reputation, your safety? It was a fair question, one Eleanor had been asking herself since the moment she'd raised her hand in that square. Because, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, I saw myself in you. I saw someone who'd lost everything, someone the world had decided was worth nothing, someone surviving day by day without really living. And I thought, if I can't save myself, maybe I can at least save one person who deserves better than the fate that was waiting for him. She smiled, a sad, complicated expression. Also, spite. Dutch Williams has been trying to force me off this land since Charles died, and buying you right out from under his brother felt like the only victory I've had in months. For the first time since meeting him, Eleanor saw Samuel's face crack into something that might have been a smile, just a slight lifting at the corners of his mouth. But it transformed his entire appearance. Spite's as good a reason as any, he agreed. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. Some understanding that went beyond words. She gambled everything on this moment. On this man. On the belief that people were more than their worst circumstances. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Dutch Williams wouldn't give up easily. The ranch needed more work than two people could possibly manage. And winter was coming with all its harsh demands. But tonight, in this kitchen with the lamp burning low and the first stars appearing through the window, Eleanor Hartwell felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt hope. The next morning arrived with the pink-gold light of dawn streaming through Eleanor's bedroom window. Birds singing their territory claims in the cottonwood trees that lined the creek behind the house. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with plans and worries. But when she finally dragged herself from bed and dressed in her work clothes, a simple cotton dress that had seen better days, covered by a worn leather apron, she felt a determination she'd thought lost forever. She'd given Samuel a room in the small bunkhouse behind the main house, the same building where Pete and the other hands had stayed. And as she approached it with fresh coffee and leftover biscuits, she half expected to find him gone, vanished into the mountains like morning mist. Instead, she found him awake and waiting, sitting on the bunkhouse steps, watching the sun rise over the eastern prairie. "Morning," Eleanor called out, and Samuel turned, nodding his acknowledgement. In the clear morning light, she could see him better. The way his hair, while wild, wasn't as unkempt as she'd first thought. The way his clothes, rough homespun and buckskin that the jail must have provided, actually fit his massive frame reasonably well. "I brought coffee and food. Thought we could talk about work while we eat." She handed him the tin cup and plate, settling onto the steps beside him with a comfortable distance between them. The ranch needs everything. Fence repairs, barn roof fixed before winter, the well needs attention, and I've got 3 horses that need proper care and training. Can you handle horses? The question felt almost ridiculous, given what she knew of his mountain survival, but it needed asking. Samuel sipped the coffee, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "Worked with horses my whole life before everything. Can gentle them without breaking them, if that's what you're asking." His voice was clearer this morning, as if a night in a real bed with a full stomach had begun to thaw something frozen inside him. Good with fixing things, too. Metalwork, woodwork, whatever needs doing. He paused, looking around at the ranch with an assessing gaze. "This place, it's bigger than what 2 people can manage alone. You planning to hire more hands?" Eleanor felt her shoulders tense at the question, at the admission she'd have to make. Can't afford more hands. I've got maybe enough money to last through winter, if I'm careful. If nothing breaks. If we don't have any emergencies. Come spring, if I can't get a cattle operation running again, I'll lose everything to the bank. The admission hung in the air between them, the raw truth of her desperation. Samuel didn't offer false comfort or empty reassurances, which Eleanor appreciated. Instead, he finished his biscuit, drained his coffee, and stood up. Then we better get to work. Show me what needs doing most urgently. His simple acceptance, his immediate willingness to tackle impossible tasks, made something warm bloom in Eleanor's chest. They spent the morning assessing the ranch's needs. The list was overwhelming. The north fence line had collapsed in 3 places. The barn roof had holes that would leak terribly when the fall rains came. The tack in the stable was falling apart, and the vegetable garden that should have been producing food for winter storage had been neglected so long it was mostly weeds. Eleanor felt her courage faltering with each new discovery of how badly things had deteriorated. But Samuel just nodded at each problem, committing it to memory, already seeming to prioritize what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. Fence first, he decided. Can't keep animals if they can wander off. Then roof. Then well. He glanced at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. You got materials? Wire, nails, lumber? Eleanor's heart sank. Some. Not enough for everything. I'll have to go to town, try to get credit from the general store. The thought of facing the townspeople after yesterday's spectacle made her stomach churn, but there was no alternative. Samuel must have read something in her expression because his jaw tightened. I'll come with you, he said. No, Eleanor replied quickly. Perhaps too quickly. That will just make things worse. People are already talking. If we both go into town together, it'll what? Make them think you're not alone out here? Make them think twice about causing trouble? Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Hartwell, you bought me out of chains yesterday and made an enemy of Dutch Williams doing it. People already talking. Might as well give them something real to talk about. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some semblance of propriety, but she knew he was right. Pride had its place, but survival mattered more. All right, she conceded. We'll go together this afternoon. But Samuel, you need to understand. The people in Redemption Falls, they're going to be hostile. They're going to say cruel things. Can you control your temper? Can you ignore the stares and whispers? Samuel's expression hardened. Lived alone in mountains for 2 years. Before that, watched my family die. Whatever those soft town folks say, it won't touch me. I'll be calm as Sunday. His words were confident, but Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands flexed, as if remembering the feel of Pete Williams's throat beneath his fingers. She hoped his control was as strong as he claimed. They worked through the afternoon, Samuel demonstrating his skill with basic repairs, while Eleanor tended to the horses and tried to salvage something from the ruined garden. Watching him work was like watching poetry written in muscle and motion. He moved with efficiency and purpose, never wasting energy, his massive hands surprisingly gentle when handling tools or materials. He'd found an old set of carpentry tools in the barn and had already patched 2 sections of fence by the time Eleanor called him for the midday meal. They ate cold meat and bread in the shade of the barn, and Eleanor found herself telling him about the ranch, about how she and Charles had come west with dreams of building something lasting, about how those dreams had slowly eroded under the weight of harsh winters, cattle disease, and Charles's growing weakness from the fever that eventually killed him. "He was a good man," Eleanor said softly, surprising herself with the honesty. "But he wasn't strong enough for this land. It broke him slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left." She looked at Samuel, wondering what he saw when he looked at her. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough either. Most days I think I'm just too stubborn to admit defeat." Samuel considered this, his dark eyes serious. "Strength comes in different forms. You stood up in that square yesterday, when every instinct probably told you to stay quiet. You faced down armed men on your own property. You're offering shelter to a stranger everyone fears. That's not weakness, Mrs. Hartwell. That's a different kind of courage than swinging fists or firing guns. But it's courage all the same." His words struck something deep inside Eleanor, validating feelings she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. They hitched the wagon in late afternoon for the journey to town, and Eleanor changed into her better dress, black again, mourning black, though she'd grown to hate the constant reminder of loss. Samuel had made an attempt to tame his appearance, pulling his long hair back with a strip of leather, and Eleanor realized with a start that beneath the wild exterior was a man who could have walked the streets of Boston without drawing undue attention, if only he'd been properly dressed and groomed. The ride to Redemption Falls was quiet, both of them preparing for the confrontation they knew was coming. The town appeared on the horizon, with its false front buildings and dusty streets, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Word of yesterday's auction would have spread through every household by now, and she could already imagine the scandalized conversations, the judgment, the assumptions. They arrived at the general store just as the afternoon rush was beginning, and Eleanor felt every eye in the street turn toward them. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the mayor's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of Redemption Falls, stood outside the Mercantile with several other church ladies, their faces arranged in expressions of shocked disapproval. "Well," Abigail said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I never thought I'd see the day when Eleanor Hartwell would parade around town with that creature in broad daylight. Your poor dear Charles must be spinning in his grave." The other women nodded in agreement, their whispers creating a buzzing sound like angry bees. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her head high as she climbed down from the wagon, Samuel following silently behind her like a massive, intimidating shadow. "Mrs. Fletcher," Eleanor replied with icy politeness, "my husband is dead, and therefore his opinions on my current business decisions are not available for consultation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have supplies to purchase." She moved to enter the store, but Abigail stepped into her path, her face pinched with righteous indignation. "You may not care about your own reputation, Eleanor, but you should consider the effect your behavior has on the rest of us. What kind of example are you setting for the young women of this town? Living alone on that ranch with a savage who—" "That's enough." Samuel's voice cut through Abigail's tirade like a blade, quiet, but carrying an undercurrent of danger that made several people step back. "Mrs. Hartwell has shown me nothing but Christian charity and fairness. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, maybe the problem isn't with her behavior, but with your own small-mindedness." The street went absolutely silent. No one spoke to Abigail Fletcher that way, especially not a man who'd been sold at auction just yesterday. Abigail's face turned an alarming shade of purple, and Eleanor held her breath, expecting an explosion. But before anything could escalate further, Sheriff Bradshaw appeared from the direction of his office, his presence immediately changing the dynamic. "Ladies," he greeted with a tip of his hat. "Samuel, Eleanor, everything all right here?" His eyes swept the scene, missing nothing. "Just fine, Tom," Eleanor replied, though her voice shook slightly. "We're here to purchase supplies, nothing more." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Then I suggest folks let you do just that. This is still a free country, and people can conduct business without harassment." His gaze lingered meaningfully on Abigail Fletcher, who finally stepped aside with a huff of indignation. Inside the general store, the proprietor, a weathered man named Henry Blackwood, who'd always been fair to Eleanor, greeted them with cautious neutrality. "Mrs. Hartwell, what can I do for you?" Eleanor pulled out her carefully prepared list. Items they absolutely needed versus items they could do without. "I need fencing wire, nails, lumber for roof repairs, and basic foodstuffs. I'll need credit, Henry, just until spring when I can pay you back." She hated asking, hated the vulnerability it exposed, but there was no alternative. Henry studied the list, his brow furrowing. "Eleanor, you know I'd help if I could, but word is Dutch Williams has been talking to all the merchants, suggesting we shouldn't extend credit to you. Says you're a bad risk, that the ranch is going under anyway, and anyone who helps you is just throwing good money away." His apologetic tone didn't lessen the blow of his words. Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. Dutch was cutting off her resources, isolating her, making sure she'd have no choice but to sell to him at rock-bottom prices. "Henry, please. I've always paid my debts. You know I'm good for it." But even as she spoke, she could see the refusal forming in Henry's eyes. Before he could voice it, however, Samuel stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket, a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "How much for everything on that list?" he asked. Henry looked surprised, but calculated quickly. "About $40 for the materials, another $20 for food supplies." Samuel counted out coins onto the counter. $60 in gold and silver, more money than a man living in the mountains should have had. "This enough?" Henry nodded, clearly confused, but unwilling to turn away cash money. "More than enough. Where did you—" "Had it cashed in the mountains," Samuel interrupted. "From before. Figured I'd never need it. But—" he glanced at Eleanor, something complicated in his expression. "Seems I was wrong." As Henry and his assistant gathered the supplies, loading them onto the wagon, Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Samuel had saved her, had used money he'd probably been hoarding as a lifeline to survival, had given it freely to help a woman he barely knew. "Samuel," she began, not sure how to express what she was feeling. "I can't accept this. That money is yours. You need it." "For what?" he interrupted gently. "Beans and bullets in a cave? That ain't living, Mrs. Hartwell. That's just existing. You gave me back something yesterday, something I thought I'd lost forever. Let me give you this." His eyes held hers, and Eleanor saw sincerity there, saw a man reclaiming his humanity, one small act of generosity at a time. She blinked back tears she refused to shed in public and simply nodded her thanks. They'd just finished loading the last of the supplies when Dutch Williams appeared at the end of the street, flanked by Pete and 5 other men, all heavily armed. The cheerful afternoon sounds of the town, the piano from the saloon, the conversations on the boardwalk, the creaking of wagons, faded into a tense silence as Dutch strode toward them with the confident swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was a large man himself, though softer than Samuel, with a prosperous belly and expensive boots that had never seen a day of real work. His face was florid and cruel. and his eyes held the coldness of someone who saw other people as either tools or obstacles. "Well, well," Dutch called out, his voice carrying across the street. "If it ain't the widow Hartwell and her pet Savage. Heard you two were making quite the spectacle." He stopped about 10 feet away, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Eleanor felt Samuel tense beside her, felt the atmosphere charge with potential violence. "Mr. Williams," she said, keeping her voice level, "we're just conducting business. We don't want any trouble." Dutch's laugh was ugly and mocking. "Oh, you don't want trouble? That's rich, considering you cost me a considerable sum yesterday. See, I had plans for that Savage, hard labor that would have killed him in a few months and saved me from paying real wages. But you, in your infinite wisdom, decided to interfere with my business. That was a mistake, Eleanor, a big one." He took a step closer, and Pete and the others spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. "So here's how this is gonna work. You're gonna sell me that ranch. Today. Right now. I'll give you a fair price. More than it's worth, honestly. And you can take your Savage and go wherever you want. Hell, I'll even throw in enough for a train ticket back east." "No," Eleanor said simply, surprised by how steady her voice was. "The ranch isn't for sale, Dutch. Not today, not ever. Now please step aside so we can go home." Dutch's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You think you can tell me no? You think having this wild man around makes you safe?" He gestured dismissively at Samuel. "I got 6 men here who'll testify that your Savage attacked us unprovoked, that we had to shoot him in self-defense. Then it'll just be you alone on that ranch again, and we both know how that story ends." The threat was naked and unambiguous, and Eleanor felt fear spike through her chest. But before she could respond, Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Eleanor and Dutch's men. "7, he said quietly. "You got 7 men if you count yourself, Dutch. But here's the thing. I survived 2 years in the Black Ridge. Killed that grizzly you heard about with my hands and a knife. Lived through winters that would have killed softer men." He paused, his dark eyes locked on Dutch's face. "You really think your men are willing to die today? Because that's what it'll cost to get to Mrs. Hartwell. Some of you will get me eventually, but I'll take at least 3 or 4 of you with me. Question is, which 3 or 4 want to volunteer?" The street went absolutely silent. Eleanor could see the calculation happening in the eyes of Dutch's men, could see them weighing loyalty against survival. Pete looked eager for a fight, but the others were less certain, shifting their weight, suddenly finding the ground very interesting. Dutch's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his pride warring with the practical consideration that Samuel might actually be able to carry out his threat. Before things could escalate further, Sheriff Bradshaw stepped out of his office, his Winchester held low but ready. "I think everyone needs to take a breath and step back," Tom said firmly. "Dutch, you and your boys head on home. Eleanor, Samuel, you finish loading and get going. Nobody's dying in my street today." His presence, combined with Samuel's threat, broke the tension enough that Dutch reluctantly gestured for his men to stand down. "This ain't over, Eleanor," Dutch promised as he backed away. "You made your choice, and now you're gonna have to live with it. That ranch will be mine one way or another, and your Savage won't be able to protect you forever." He spat in the dust near her feet, a final insult, then turned and walked away, his men following. Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief as the immediate danger passed. But she knew Dutch's words were more than empty threats. She'd made an enemy who had the power and resources to destroy her, and only Samuel's presence and the sheriff's intervention had prevented violence today. How long could they keep holding off the inevitable? The question haunted her as they finished loading the wagon and prepared for the long ride home. The journey back to the ranch felt different than the morning trip, heavier somehow, weighted with the knowledge of just how precarious their situation had become. Samuel drove the wagon this time, his hands sure on the reins, while Eleanor sat beside him, processing everything that had happened. The sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of orange and purple, and she found herself watching Samuel's profile, seeing not the savage the townspeople feared, but a man who'd stepped between her and danger without hesitation. A man who'd given his last resources to help her. A man who was slowly becoming something more than a convenient solution to her labor shortage. "Thank you," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "for everything today, for standing up to Dutch, for using your money, for," she paused, searching for the right words, "for making me feel less alone." Samuel glanced at her, his expression softer than she'd yet seen it. "You stood up for me first, Mrs. Hartwell. Yesterday in that square, you didn't see a savage or a man, or something to be used and discarded. You saw a person. That means something." He returned his attention to the road, but Eleanor could see tension in his jaw, emotions he was working to contain. "5 years I've been barely human, living in a cave, eating raw meat sometimes, forgetting how to speak, forgetting why it mattered. Then you walk up to that auction block and see something worth saving. Maybe I'm just returning the favor." His words struck her deeply, revealing the core of what was building between them. Mutual recognition of pain, mutual offering of redemption. Two damaged people trying to build something worth living for from the ruins of their respective tragedies. As they approached the ranch, something felt wrong. Eleanor noticed it first, the front door of the house standing open, when she distinctly remembered closing and locking it. The unnatural silence where her horses should have been nickering in anticipation of their return. Samuel noticed it too, pulling the wagon to a stop well short of the house. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice taking on the hardness of someone who'd survived too many ambushes to ignore warning signs. He climbed down silently, moving toward the house with the predatory grace Eleanor had seen when he'd taken down Pete Williams. She ignored his instruction and followed anyway, her heart hammering, one hand gripping a heavy wrench from the supply pile, in case she needed a weapon. What they found inside made Eleanor's blood run cold. The house had been ransacked, not robbed, but deliberately vandalized. Furniture overturned, her mother's china smashed, photographs torn from the mantel and ground into the floor. Someone had carved crude words into the dining table: "Leave" and "savage lover," gouged deep into the wood. Her clothes had been pulled from the bedroom and shredded, feathers from torn pillows covering everything like obscene snow. But worst of all, on the living room wall, where her wedding photograph had hung, someone had painted in crude letters, "Last warning, next time you burn." Eleanor stood in the middle of the destruction, feeling violation wash over her in waves, feeling the last threads of her composure beginning to unravel. She'd tried so hard to hold on, to be strong, to not break, but this felt like too much. "Pete," Samuel said flatly, examining the damage with an experienced eye. "He was here during the day while we were in town. Probably had 1 or 2 others with him." He picked up a torn photograph. Eleanor on her wedding day. Young and hopeful. The image now slashed beyond recognition. They want you scared, want you to run. He looked at Eleanor, seeing the tears streaming down her face, despite her best efforts to hold them back. Question is, you gonna give them what they want? His words, brutal in their directness, cut through Eleanor's despair. She wiped her face roughly, anger beginning to burn through the fear and violation. No, she said, her voice shaking but firm. No, I'm not running. This is my home, my land, and they don't get to take it from me through intimidation and violence. She began picking up pieces of her destroyed possessions, setting aside what could be salvaged, sweeping aside what couldn't. Help me clean this up, Samuel. Then we're going to bar every door and window, and tomorrow we start fortifying this place like we're preparing for war. They worked through the night, Eleanor refusing to sleep despite exhaustion, refusing to let the violation stand without response. Samuel nailed boards over windows that had been broken, replaced the lock on the front door with something stronger, and helped Eleanor sort through the destruction. As they worked, she found herself talking about her childhood in Massachusetts, about her father's idealism, about meeting Charles and believing love would be enough to conquer any challenge, about the slow realization that she'd been naive about what the West demanded. Samuel listened without judgment, occasionally sharing fragments of his own story, his daughter's laugh, his wife's cooking, the guilt that still haunted him for not being able to protect them. The years of numbness that followed. In the shared darkness of that violated house, with only lamplight keeping the shadows at bay, they formed a bond deeper than convenience or gratitude. By dawn, the house was as clean as they could make it, missing much of what had given it warmth, but functional again. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over her property, feeling the weight of the night, but also something else. Resolve that had been tempered in fire and come out stronger. Samuel joined her, 2 cups of coffee in his massive hands, and they stood together in companionable silence. "They'll come again," he said finally. "Dutch won't stop with vandalism. Next time it'll be worse. Fire, maybe, or a direct attack." Eleanor nodded, knowing he was right. "Then we prepare for it. We turn this ranch into a fortress if we have to. We make it so damn difficult to take that even Dutch Williams will think twice." She sipped her coffee, tasting bitterness and determination in equal measure. "And Samuel, thank you for staying. I know you could have walked away last night, gone back to your mountains. But you stayed, and that means everything." Samuel turned to face her fully, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Connection, warmth, the beginning of something neither of them had expected. "Ain't got nothing in those mountains worth going back to," he said quietly. "Been dead inside so long, I forgot what it felt like to care about something, to fight for something. You reminded me. This ranch, this fight, it's worth having. You're worth fighting for." His words hung in the air between them, honest and raw, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, felt the first tendrils of something that might become more than gratitude or mutual survival. She wasn't ready to name it yet, wasn't ready to acknowledge what was building between them, but she felt it nonetheless, a warmth spreading through the frozen places in her heart, a possibility she hadn't dared imagine. The days that followed established a new rhythm at the Hartwell Ranch. Samuel threw himself into the work with tireless energy, repairing fences, fixing the barn roof, strengthening the house's defenses. Eleanor worked alongside him when she could, tending the horses, salvaging the garden, preparing meals that filled the house with warmth and the smells of home cooking, scents that had been absent too long. They fell into an easy partnership, communicating as much through looks and gestures as through words, each anticipating what the other needed without being asked. Samuel would find Eleanor struggling with a heavy bucket and silently take it from her hands. Eleanor would notice Samuel's worn-through shirt and quietly leave a new one she'd altered to fit his frame on the bunkhouse steps. Small kindnesses that spoke of growing trust and affection neither dared voice aloud. On the third day after the vandalism, Eleanor was working with one of her horses, a young mare named Daisy, who'd been too long without proper training, when she noticed Samuel watching from the fence rail. She'd been trying to get the mare comfortable with a saddle, but Daisy was skittish, shying away whenever Eleanor approached with the tack. "Problem?" Samuel asked, his tone curious rather than critical. Eleanor blew a strand of hair from her face, frustration evident. "She's terrified of the saddle. Charles used to train the horses, but he'd use spurs and whips, force them to submit. I hate it, but I don't know another way." She gestured helplessly at the nervous mare. "And I need her trained if I'm going to rebuild the herd come spring." Samuel climbed the fence rail and dropped into the corral with a grace surprising for his size. His movements slow and deliberate so as not to spook the horse further. "There's another way," he said, approaching Daisy with his hands open and empty, humming a low sound that wasn't quite a song, but something rhythmic and soothing. The mare's ears pricked forward, curiosity overcoming fear. Samuel didn't rush, didn't grab. He just stood there, letting the horse come to him in her own time, rewarding her approach with gentle touches and continued humming. Eleanor watched, fascinated, as the mare that had been panicking moments before now nuzzled Samuel's massive hand, accepting his presence without fear. "It's about trust," Samuel explained softly, never taking his eyes off Daisy. "Horse needs to know you won't hurt her, that you understand she's scared, that you'll protect her, not harm her. Takes longer than breaking with violence, but the bond you build lasts. Horse trained with kindness will carry you into hell if you ask. Horse broken by fear will throw you first chance it gets." Over the next hour, Eleanor watched Samuel work with Daisy, his patience infinite, his understanding of the horse's psychology evident in every movement. By the time he was done, Daisy was wearing the saddle without protest, responding to the gentlest touches of rein and heel, a different animal than the terrified creature Eleanor had been struggling with. "How did you learn this?" Eleanor asked, awed by the transformation. Samuel's expression grew distant, memories pulling him backward in time. "My wife's people. She was half Cheyenne. They had ways with horses that white men called magic, but was just patience and respect. Spent years learning from them, learning to see the world through the horse's eyes, to earn trust instead of demand obedience." He stroked Daisy's neck affectionately. "Same principle works for people too, I reckon. Fear might make someone obey, but it ain't the same as loyalty freely given." His words resonated with Eleanor on multiple levels, and she found herself thinking about the parallels between Samuel's approach to Daisy and his approach to her. The patience, the respect, the understanding that trust couldn't be forced, but had to be earned through consistent kindness and protection. She realized that without consciously deciding to, she'd begun to trust him completely, to rely on him not just for physical labor, but for companionship, for perspective, for the feeling that she wasn't alone in her struggles. It was a dangerous thing, this trust, because it made her vulnerable in ways she hadn't been since Charles's death. But it also made her feel alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "Teach me," she said impulsively. "Teach me how to work with horses your way. Teach me how to see what you see." Samuel looked at her with surprise and something deeper. Approval, maybe, or recognition of her willingness to learn. "All right," he agreed. "But it ain't just about horses, Mrs. Hartwell. This way of thinking changes how you see everything." They spent the afternoon together in the corral, Samuel demonstrating his methods, while Eleanor practiced, her initial clumsiness giving way to growing confidence. She found herself laughing for the first time in months when Daisy playfully nipped at her pocket, looking for the carrots she'd hidden there. Found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since Charles's illness began. Samuel's laugh, when it came, was rusty and surprised, as if he too had forgotten what joy sounded like. The sound of their combined laughter echoed across the empty prairie, a declaration of life persisting against all efforts to crush it. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting everything in warm gold, Eleanor realized with a start that she was happy, genuinely, simply happy in this moment, despite everything threatening to destroy what she was building. That night, over a dinner of venison stew that Samuel had provided by hunting on the far edge of the property, they talked more freely than they had before. Eleanor found herself telling him about her dreams for the ranch, about wanting to breed horses using gentle methods, about building something that respected the land and the animals rather than just exploiting them. Samuel listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering suggestions drawn from his years of experience, and Eleanor realized he was treating her ideas with respect, not condescension. Something Charles had rarely done, always assuming he knew better, despite her educated insights. "You could do it," Samuel said firmly when she expressed doubt. "Could build something here that'd make other ranches look like they're stuck in the dark ages. Just needs time and work." The certainty in his voice made Eleanor believe it might actually be possible. They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, multiple horses, coming fast. Samuel was on his feet instantly, his hand finding the rifle Eleanor kept by the door, his body once again taking on that predatory stillness that spoke of violence ready to be unleashed. Eleanor felt her heart racing as she stood beside him, watching through the window as riders materialized out of the growing darkness. But these weren't Dutch Williams's men. The lead rider wore a star on his vest, and Sheriff Bradshaw's voice called out from the yard, "Eleanor, Samuel, it's Tom Bradshaw. I need to talk to you both. It's important." Relief washed through Eleanor, though she wondered what could bring the sheriff out this late. Samuel lowered the rifle, but didn't set it aside completely as Eleanor opened the door to let Tom inside. The sheriff looked grim as he removed his hat, his weathered face lined with worry. "I thought you both should know. There's trouble brewing in town. Dutch Williams has been talking to some of the other ranchers, convincing them that you two are a threat to property values, to the moral fiber of the community. He's organizing a group of men, calling it a citizens' committee, but what he really means is a mob." Tom paused, meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I can't prove it yet, but I think he's planning to ride out here, force you off the land through intimidation or worse. Could be as soon as tomorrow night. I wanted to warn you, give you a chance to—" "To what?" Eleanor interrupted. "To run? To abandon everything I've worked for because Dutch Williams doesn't like me standing up to him?" She felt anger rising, hot and fierce. I won't do it, Tom. This is my home, my land. If Dutch wants it, he'll have to take it by force, and I'll make sure there's legal consequences. Sheriff Bradshaw sighed heavily. Eleanor, you need to understand. I'm one man with 2 deputies. If Dutch brings 20 or 30 men out here, I can't protect you. The law only works when people choose to respect it, and Dutch has convinced a lot of folks that what he's doing is righteous, that he's protecting the community from— Tom glanced at Samuel uncomfortably, from dangerous elements. The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt fury burning in her chest. The only dangerous element in this county is Dutch Williams and his hired thugs, she said flatly. Samuel hasn't done anything except honest work and defend me when necessary. If people choose to see him as a threat, that says more about their prejudice than his character. She paced the small living room, her mind racing through options. What if we got testimony? What if we could prove Dutch is organizing criminal harassment? Would that give you enough to arrest him? Maybe, Tom admitted reluctantly, but getting people to testify against Dutch is near impossible. He controls too much of the local economy, and folks are scared of losing their livelihoods. He paused, then looked at Samuel with assessment in his eyes. Though if you're determined to stay and fight, I might have a suggestion. There's a circuit judge coming through next week, Judge Harrison Morrison. He's a fair man, not in Dutch's pocket, and he takes property rights seriously. If you could hold out until he arrives, you might be able to get an injunction against Dutch's harassment. Maybe even press charges for the vandalism if we can link it back to him. Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest, fragile but real. A week. They just had to survive for one more week, and they might have legal recourse that could break Dutch's hold on the situation. Samuel had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice thoughtful and strategic. A week gives us time to prepare properly. I can set up defensive positions around the property. Make sure anyone approaching has to come through choke points we control. Can also reach out to the Cheyenne. There's a band camps about 15 miles north, led by Chief Bearheart's son. They remember me, and they don't much care for Dutch Williams, since he tried to run them off land that treaty guaranteed them. Might be willing to help if I ask right. Eleanor looked at him with surprise, realizing he'd been thinking tactically about their defense, planning for possibilities she hadn't even considered. Would they actually help us? She asked. Against other white people? Samuel's expression was complicated, mixing old loyalties with new realities. Maybe. Bearheart's people believe in debts, in reciprocal justice. I helped them once, warned them about a cavalry patrol that was looking for trouble. They might return that favor now, especially if I explain the situation. He looked at Sheriff Bradshaw. That sit all right with you, Sheriff? Or will having Indians involved cause you legal problems? Tom Bradshaw considered this carefully, the pragmatic lawman weighing ideals against realities. Officially, I'd have to oppose it. Unofficially, if things turn violent and you have help that keeps you alive until I can bring legal force to bear, I ain't gonna look too close at where that help came from. He met Samuel's eyes with understanding. Just make sure they know the rules. Defense only, no offensive action. Nothing that would let Dutch claim you started the violence. Can you do that? Samuel nodded once, firm and certain. I'll ride out at first light tomorrow. Talk to Running Wolf. That's Bearheart's son. Won't make promises I can't keep, but I'll explain the situation, see if they're willing to at least watch our backs. The plan was taking shape, fragile and desperate, but better than nothing. They had 1 week to prepare. 1 week to turn the Hartwell Ranch into something defensible. 1 week before Judge Morrison arrived and they could seek legal protection. After Sheriff Bradshaw departed, with promises to do everything legally possible to slow Dutch Williams down, Eleanor and Samuel stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. The air had turned cool, with the promise of fall, and Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "This is insane," she said quietly. "A week ago, I was just trying to survive day to day, and now I'm preparing for what amounts to a siege, allying with Cheyenne warriors, and betting everything on a judge I've never met." She laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. "My parents would be horrified if they could see me now. Their proper Boston daughter, building fortifications and planning defense strategies like some frontier warrior woman." Samuel didn't laugh, but his voice held warmth when he responded. "Your parents raised someone strong enough to do what needed doing. That's worth more than propriety." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Eleanor," the use of her first name, dropping the formal Mrs. Hartwell, made her breath catch. "Whatever happens next week, I want you to know something. You gave me back my life. Before you, I was just existing, waiting to die, without admitting I was waiting. But now, I've got something worth living for, worth fighting for. So whatever Dutch Williams brings, he's gonna have to go through me first. And I promise you, that won't be easy for him." Eleanor turned to face him fully, looking up at the man who'd become so much more than a laborer she'd impulsively purchased. In the starlight, his features seemed softer, less savage, more human. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I've been falling for you. I know that's crazy. We barely know each other, and everything is so complicated. But I need you to know in case—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that one of them might not survive the coming confrontation. Samuel's massive hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Not crazy," he said firmly. "Maybe the only sane thing in this whole mess. I've been falling for you, too. From the moment you stood up in that square and saw a person instead of an animal. Never thought I'd feel anything again after losing my family. But you made me remember what it's like to care, to hope, to want more than just survival." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable and sweet and desperate all at once. Two damaged people finding solace and strength in each other, creating something new from the ruins of their respective pasts. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of relief, of finally letting herself feel something beyond grief and determination. "We're going to survive this," she said fiercely. "We're going to hold this ranch, get Judge Morrison's help, build the life we both deserve. Dutch Williams doesn't get to win." Samuel pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with protective strength. "We'll survive," he agreed. Together. They stood there on the porch, two unlikely allies who'd become something more, watching the stars wheel overhead and gathering strength for the battles ahead. The next morning, Samuel departed before dawn on Eleanor's fastest horse, heading north toward the Cheyenne encampment, while Eleanor began the work of fortifying the ranch. She dragged barrels into position around the house that could serve as cover during a firefight, filled buckets with water in case of fire, and moved all her ammunition and her late husband's rifle collection into easily accessible positions. The work was hard and frightening, forcing her to confront the reality that violence might be coming to her home. But she refused to let fear paralyze her. She'd made her stand, and now she'd defend it with everything she had. By midday, the house looked less like a home and more like a fortress. But Eleanor felt grim satisfaction at the preparations. If Dutch wanted to take what was hers, he'd pay a price for it. Samuel returned late in the afternoon, and Eleanor's heart leaped at the sight of him riding across the prairie, alive and whole. He wasn't alone. 3 Cheyenne warriors rode with him, young men with alert eyes and weapons that spoke of both traditional and modern warfare. Samuel dismounted and performed introductions with respectful formality. "Eleanor, this is Running Wolf, son of Chief Bearheart, and his cousins Black Elk and Thunderheart. They've agreed to help us watch for Dutch's men, provide warning if trouble comes." The 3 warriors nodded to Eleanor with reserved courtesy, and she found herself grateful for their presence, despite knowing how much more complicated this made everything. Running Wolf spoke decent English, and his assessment of the ranch's defenses was both comprehensive and slightly critical. "You've done well with limited resources," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, "but you need more warning time. My cousins and I will position ourselves on the high ground to the east and west. If many men come, we'll signal with fire. That should give you time to prepare." Over the next several days, an unlikely alliance formed. The Cheyenne warriors, initially wary, gradually warmed to Eleanor and Samuel, sharing meals and stories in the evenings after the day's defensive preparations were complete. Eleanor learned that Running Wolf's people had their own grievances with Dutch Williams. He'd attempted to drive them from land guaranteed by treaty, had attacked their hunters, and had spread rumors about them to justify violence. Their decision to help wasn't just about repaying Samuel. It was about resisting a common enemy who represented the worst of what the frontier could produce: greed masked as progress, violence disguised as civilization. On the 5th night, as Eleanor prepared dinner for the unlikely group defending her home, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, she'd been alone, desperate, convinced her story would end in failure and loss. Now she stood in a kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of different languages mixing. Samuel's deep voice speaking halting Cheyenne, Running Wolf's careful English, the warriors' laughter at some shared joke. Outside, her ranch still faced existential threat, but inside these walls, something beautiful was happening. People from vastly different worlds were finding common ground, building bonds based on mutual respect and shared purpose. It was, Eleanor thought, exactly what the West could be at its best. Not the violent conquest that men like Dutch Williams represented, but a meeting place where different peoples could forge new relationships. Samuel found her standing at the window, lost in thought, and came to stand beside her. His presence had become so familiar, so essential, that Eleanor couldn't imagine facing the coming days without him. "You're worried," he observed quietly. "About tomorrow?" Eleanor nodded. Tomorrow was the 6th day. Judge Morrison was due to arrive in Redemption Falls the following afternoon, which meant if Dutch Williams was going to make his move, it would likely be tonight or tomorrow morning. Sheriff Bradshaw had sent word that Dutch had indeed assembled a group of men, at least 25, and that they'd been drinking heavily at the saloon, working themselves up to violence. "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but I'm also ready. Whatever happens, We face it together, and that makes all the difference. Samuel's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. We're gonna make it through this, he promised. All of us. The attack came just before dawn, when the world was caught in that gray moment between night and day. Running Wolf's warning fire blazed on the eastern ridge, two columns of smoke that signaled many riders approaching fast. Eleanor was awake instantly, her heart pounding as she grabbed her rifle and took her position at the window Samuel had fortified with heavy shutters that could be opened just enough to shoot through. Samuel moved through the house with calm efficiency, checking their defenses, making sure water barrels were positioned against fire, that ammunition was distributed properly. The Cheyenne warriors had taken positions in the barn and behind the corral fence, creating a crossfire pattern that would make any direct assault costly. As the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, Eleanor saw them, Dutch Williams leading at least 30 men, all armed, faces twisted with alcohol-fueled courage and righteous fury. They pulled up about 50 yards from the house, forming a rough semicircle, and Dutch raised his hand for silence. Eleanor Hartwell. Dutch's voice carried across the morning air, amplified by the stillness before sunrise. You've had your warning. This is your last chance to do this, peaceable-like. Sign over the deed to your property, take your savage, and leave, and nobody gets hurt. Refuse, and we're authorized by the Citizens Committee to remove you by force. His words dripped with false legitimacy, the pretense that mob violence was somehow lawful. Eleanor felt rage burn through her fear, felt the injustice of it all crystallize into diamond-hard determination. She opened the shutter, just enough for her voice to carry. This is my legal property, Dutch Williams. You have no authority here, and what you're doing is criminal trespass and attempted robbery. Leave now or face the consequences. Her voice was steady, brooking no compromise, and she saw Dutch's face darken with anger at her continued defiance. So be it, Dutch shouted, and Eleanor saw him gesture to his men. Burn 'em out. If she won't leave peaceable, we'll smoke her out like the vermin she is. Several men lit torches, and Eleanor's stomach clenched as she realized they meant to set fire to her home, her barn, everything she'd built. But before they could advance, Samuel's voice rang out from a different window, carrying a promise of violence that made several of the men falter. First man who throws a torch dies. So does the second and third. Question is, who wants to volunteer? As if to emphasize his point, Samuel fired a single shot that struck the ground directly in front of the nearest torchbearer. Close enough that the man's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing him. The message was clear. Samuel could have killed him, but chose not to, which somehow made the threat even more terrifying. The precision shot, the controlled demonstration of deadly skill, made Dutch's men reconsider their easy victory. He's bluffing! Keith Williams shouted from the crowd. There's only 2 of them. We got numbers. But his bravado sounded hollow even to his own ears. Then, from the barn, Running Wolf's voice cut through the tension, speaking in heavily accented but clear English. Not 2, 6, and we do not miss. To emphasize his point, 3 arrows flew from different positions, not aimed at men, but at the ground around them, each one landing with deadly precision, exactly where the archer intended. The sudden appearance of Cheyenne warriors, fighting alongside Eleanor, shattered whatever courage Dutch's men had built up. Murmurs of concern rippled through the mob. Facing a savage and a desperate widow was one thing, but facing trained warriors who could kill from concealed positions was something else entirely. Several men at the back of the group quietly turned their horses, deciding that Dutch Williams's money wasn't worth dying for. Dutch saw his mob beginning to dissolve and made a desperate play. $20 gold to the man who burns that barn. 50 to whoever brings me that savage alive. The promise of significant money rallied some of his harder men, the ones who'd kill for pay without moral qualms. 5 riders spurred their horses forward, torches held high, while others provided covering fire. Bullets slamming into the house's walls and shutters. Eleanor fired back, her shot taking one man's hat clean off his head without touching him, a warning that was also a message about her accuracy. Samuel's rifle boomed repeatedly, each shot driving attackers back without killing, though Eleanor knew he could have dropped several men if he'd chosen to. The Cheyenne warrior's arrows flew with lethal precision, striking horses rather than men, sending riders tumbling into the dirt, forcing retreats. For several chaotic minutes, the ranch yard was filled with gunfire, shouting, terrified horses, and the acrid smell of burning torches. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, a bugle call, military and unmistakable. Eleanor's heart leaped as she saw riders cresting the rise to the south, sunlight glinting off cavalry sabers and brass buttons. A full troop of Army cavalry, at least 40 soldiers, thundered toward the ranch, with Sheriff Bradshaw and Judge Morrison riding at their front. Dutch Williams' face went white as he realized the trap he'd ridden into, caught in the act of armed assault, with witnesses including a judge and Army officers. His carefully constructed pretense of legitimacy shattered completely. "Hold your fire!" Dutch screamed at his men. But several continued shooting in panic, and Eleanor saw one bullet strike perilously close to the judge's horse. That sealed Dutch's fate. Firing on a federal judge was a hanging offense, and everyone present knew it. The cavalry surrounded Dutch's mob with professional efficiency, soldiers dismounting with rifles raised, cutting off all escape routes. Captain James Thornton, a weathered officer with gray at his temples, rode forward to take command of the situation. "By the authority vested in me by the United States Army, and in the presence of Circuit Judge Harrison Morrison, I am placing all of you under arrest for armed assault, attempted arson, and firing upon a federal officer. Throw down your weapons immediately." His voice carried absolute authority, and Dutch's men complied quickly, weapons clattering to the ground as they raised their hands. Dutch himself sat frozen in his saddle, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, as his carefully planned intimidation collapsed into criminal charges that could end with his neck in a noose. Sheriff Bradshaw moved through the crowd, systematically disarming men and placing them under guard, his expression grim but satisfied. Judge Morrison, a dignified man in his 60s, with silver hair and keen eyes that missed nothing, dismounted and approached the house. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Judge Harrison Morrison. Sheriff Bradshaw informed me of your situation and requested military assistance given the scale of the threat. May I come inside?" Eleanor opened the door with shaking hands, relief washing over her so strongly she nearly collapsed. Samuel was beside her instantly, his hand steadying her elbow, and together they welcomed the judge into the home they'd defended against impossible odds. Running Wolf and his cousins emerged from their positions, and Eleanor saw the soldiers' hands tighten on their weapons. But Captain Thornton made a sharp gesture, ordering them to stand down. "These warriors," Eleanor said firmly, were invited guests who helped defend my legal property against criminal assault. They're under my protection. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded acceptance. Over the next hour, Judge Morrison took testimony from everyone present. Eleanor's account of Dutch Williams's escalating harassment, Samuel's witness to the vandalism and threats, Sheriff Bradshaw's documentation of the citizens, committee that was really just an organized mob, and even Running Wolf's statement about Dutch's illegal attempts to drive his people from treaty land. The soldiers held Dutch's men under guard while the judge compiled evidence, and with each piece of testimony, Dutch's situation grew more desperate. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of legal authority that could not be disputed. Mr. Williams, you and your associates are hereby charged with criminal conspiracy, attempted arson, armed assault, attempted theft through intimidation, destruction of property, and firing upon a federal judge. You will be transported to the territorial prison to await trial, where I expect you'll receive a sentence of no less than 15 years hard labor, assuming the prosecutor doesn't seek hanging for the attack on myself. Dutch's face had gone from white to purple, veins bulging at his temples. You can't do this. I'm a respected businessman. I have rights. His protests rang hollow, given that he'd just led an armed mob against a widow's ranch. Judge Morrison's expression was cold as winter steel. You have the right to a fair trial, Mr. Williams, which is more than you were prepared to give Mrs. Hartwell. As for your business holdings, I'm issuing an order freezing your assets pending investigation into other possible criminal activities. I suspect when we examine your affairs closely, we'll find a pattern of intimidation, illegal land seizures, and worse. He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm issuing a permanent injunction against anyone interfering with your property or person. Furthermore, given the circumstances and your need for protection while Mr. Williams' associates remain at large, I'm authorizing a military detail to remain on your property for the next month. Captain Thornton, assign a squad for rotating guard duty. The captain saluted crisply and moved to implement the order. As the cavalry prepared to transport Dutch and his men back to Redemption Falls for formal processing, Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. They'd survived. Against impossible odds, facing overwhelming force, they'd held their ground and won. Not through superior violence, but through courage, alliance, and the eventual intervention of legitimate law. Samuel stood beside her, and when their hands clasped together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It's over, Eleanor breathed, hardly daring to believe it. We're actually going to be able to build something here. Samuel's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a gesture of tenderness that still surprised her, coming from someone the town had called savage. Beginnings just starting, he corrected gently. Real work comes now, building that horse operation you dreamed about, making this ranch into something special. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. If you'll have me, I'd like to be part of that future. Not as hired help, but as— he struggled for words, but Eleanor understood perfectly. As my partner, Eleanor finished, her heart swelling with emotions too large for her chest to contain. In every way that matters. Yes, Samuel. Yes to all of it. She turned to face him fully, not caring that soldiers and warriors and the judge himself might witness what came next. I love you. I don't care that we barely know each other. Don't care what anyone thinks. You saved me, not just from Dutch Williams, but from the loneliness and despair that was eating me alive. You made me remember what it feels like to hope to dream, to believe in possibilities I thought died with Charles. So yes, I'll have you, today and every day after, for as long as you'll stay." Her declaration was bold and scandalous, and absolutely sincere, and she saw tears gathering in Samuel's dark eyes as he pulled her close, their embrace witnessed by the unlikely collection of people who'd made this victory possible. Running Wolf approached with his cousins, preparing to return to their encampment now that the danger had passed. "You fight well, Eleanor Hartwell," the young chief said with approval. "You have courage and honor. Our people will remember this alliance. Remember that not all white settlers are like Dutch Williams. If you need help again, send word. We will come." Eleanor felt emotion tighten her throat at the formal offer of friendship, at the bridge being built between their peoples. "Thank you, Running Wolf, for everything. Please tell your father that his son honored his name today, and that the Hartwell Ranch will always welcome the Cheyenne people." The warriors mounted their horses and rode north, and Eleanor watched them go with gratitude for their intervention and hope that the alliance they'd forged might endure beyond this single crisis. Judge Morrison approached before departing, his weathered face creased with what might have been approval. "Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Bridger, yes, Sheriff Bradshaw informed me of your real identity, Samuel. I want you to know that what you've accomplished here is significant beyond just defending one property. You've demonstrated that different peoples can work together toward justice, that courage and principles still matter on this frontier, and that the law, when properly applied, can protect the vulnerable from the powerful. I'll be watching your ranch's progress with great interest, and if you need legal assistance in the future, you need only send word." He tipped his hat to Eleanor with old-fashioned courtesy. "Also, Mrs. Hartwell, while I cannot perform marriages in my judicial capacity, I can recommend several ministers in Redemption Falls who would be happy to officiate when you're ready. I suspect that day may come sooner rather than later." His knowing smile suggested he'd witnessed their embrace and approved. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and transformation. With Dutch Williams imprisoned and his organization dismantled, many of his former victims found courage to speak up, bringing additional charges that ensured he'd spend decades behind bars. Pete Williams and the other raiders received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, effectively ending their threat. The Army detail that remained provided both security and unexpected assistance. Several soldiers had ranching experience and helped Samuel repair structures and rebuild fences, while others proved skilled at horse training and veterinary care. Captain Thornton, who'd grown up on a ranch in Texas, offered advice on breeding programs and connected Eleanor with reputable horse dealers who might purchase her trained animals. The ranch began to feel less like a desperate last stand and more like a thriving enterprise with genuine potential. Eleanor and Samuel fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, working together through the days, sharing meals and stories through the evenings, their relationship deepening from survival partnership to genuine love with each passing sunrise. Samuel gradually emerged from the shell of wildness that had protected him through his years of isolation, remembering how to smile freely, how to laugh, how to hope for futures beyond mere survival. Eleanor watched him transform, saw the intelligent, gentle man beneath the savage exterior the town had feared, and fell more in love with each revelation. They spoke often of their shared losses, Samuel's wife and daughter, Eleanor's husband, and the children she'd never had, not to dwell in grief, but to honor those memories while building something new. Their love didn't erase the past, but it created space for healing and growth neither had thought possible. In late October, as the first snow began to dust the mountains and the prairie grass turned golden brown, Eleanor and Samuel stood before Reverend Matthews in the small church in Redemption Falls, speaking vows that bound them together in the eyes of God and law. The wedding was small. Sheriff Bradshaw stood as witness along with Captain Thornton, and several townspeople who'd always been kind to Eleanor attended despite lingering scandal about her choices. Running Wolf and a delegation of Cheyenne warriors came as honored guests, their presence making the ceremony a symbol of reconciliation and new possibilities. When Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto Eleanor's finger, a ring he'd purchased with money earned from selling furs to traveling traders, she felt the weight of it as both promise and protection, a declaration that she was no longer alone in facing whatever challenges the frontier might bring. The winter that followed was hard, as all frontier winters were. But Eleanor and Samuel faced it together, their love growing stronger through shared work and quiet evenings by the fire. They trained horses using Samuel's gentle methods, building a reputation for producing animals that were responsive and reliable rather than merely broken. Word spread among ranchers and cavalry officers that the Hartwell Ranch sold horses trained with techniques that produced superior results, and orders began coming in faster than they could fill. Eleanor's business sense, combined with Samuel's practical skills, created operation that was both ethical and profitable, exactly the dream she'd imagined, but thought impossible to achieve alone. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and painting the prairie green, they turned a profit substantial enough to pay off her remaining debts and begin expanding operations. As Eleanor stood on her porch one April morning, watching Samuel work with a young stallion in the corral, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate widow, ready to lose everything, impulsively spending her last $100 on a man everyone called Savage. Now, she was a successful rancher with a thriving business, a husband who loved and respected her, and alliances that spanned cultures and communities. The ranch that had nearly crushed her with its demands had become a sanctuary, a place where different worlds met and created something beautiful. She thought of her father's teachings about human dignity, about seeing past surfaces to the person beneath, and smiled at how those lessons had saved her life in ways he never could have predicted. Samuel noticed her watching and waved, his smile transforming his face into something that bore no resemblance to the chained man who'd stood on that auction block. Eleanor waved back, then descended the porch steps to join him in the corral, their partnership as natural now as the sunrise. Together they worked with the horses, their movements synchronized through months of collaboration, their communication requiring few words, because they'd learned to read each other with the same intuition Samuel used with the animals. This was their life now: honest work, mutual respect, love that had been forged in fire and emerged stronger for the tempering. The frontier had tried to break them both, but instead it had brought them together, creating something neither could have built alone. Years later, when traveling storytellers would tell tales of the Hartwell Ranch and the unlikely love story of the widow and the mountain man. They'd emphasize the dramatic confrontation with Dutch Williams, the alliance with the Cheyenne warriors, the intervention of cavalry and Judge at the crucial moment. But Eleanor would always know the real story was quieter and more profound. It was about two broken people finding each other at their lowest points, about choosing courage over fear, about extending compassion when hatred would have been easier, about building bridges instead of walls. It was about a woman who looked past the surface to see the man worth saving, and a man who found reasons to rejoin humanity because someone believed he deserved dignity and redemption. The Hartwell Ranch prospered through the years, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of its horses and the fairness of its dealings. Eleanor and Samuel's partnership became legendary, though not always in the romanticized ways people imagined. They argued sometimes about business decisions, disagreed about training methods, faced the normal challenges of any marriage. But beneath the daily difficulties was a foundation of respect and love, so solid that nothing could shake it. They had children eventually, 3 daughters who grew up riding horses before they could walk, learning from both their parents' skills, carrying forward the ranch's reputation and philosophy. The girls learned their mother's business acumen and their father's gift with animals, creating the next generation of ranchers who would transform the territory's approach to horse breeding. Samuel never completely lost the wildness that had sustained him through his mountain years, but he channeled it into productive purposes, using his tracking skills to help locate lost children or straying cattle, teaching young ranchers survival techniques that could save lives during harsh winters, serving as a bridge between white settlers and Cheyenne communities when conflicts arose. Running Wolf remained a close friend through the decades, and the alliance between the Hartwell Ranch and the Cheyenne people became a model for how different cultures could coexist peacefully and beneficially. When Eleanor's daughters married, one of them chose a Cheyenne warrior as her husband, creating bonds between peoples that transcended the violence and division that characterized so much of frontier history. On their 10th anniversary, Samuel and Eleanor rode together to the rise overlooking their property, watching the sun set over land they'd defended against impossible odds and transformed into something lasting. The ranch stretched before them, corrals full of magnificent horses, barns in perfect repair, a house that had grown from the original structure to accommodate their expanding family, fields green with crops that would feed both people and animals through the coming winter. Eleanor leaned against Samuel's solid warmth, his arm around her shoulders, and felt contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the mountains, rejoining civilization, building all of this instead of remaining free?" Samuel considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries, then shook his head slowly. "Mountains were just a place to wait for death," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom earned through suffering and redemption. "Wasn't freedom, was just emptiness wearing freedom's clothes. This," he gestured at the ranch, at their life together, "this is real freedom. Freedom to build something meaningful, to love and be loved, to create a legacy that outlasts us. You taught me that, Eleanor. Taught me that surviving ain't the same as living, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is open their heart again after it's been shattered. So no, I don't regret any of it. This life with you, these years we've built together, they're the greatest gift I ever received." His words made Eleanor's tears fall freely, though they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Tears of gratitude for the strange path that had brought them together. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, they rode back to the ranch house, where their daughters waited with dinner prepared and stories to share about the day's adventures. The life they'd built wasn't perfect, no life was, but it was real and hard-won and deeply meaningful. Eleanor Hardwell, who'd once been so desperate she'd gambled everything on a stranger in chains, had found not just survival, but genuine happiness. Not just security, but profound love. Not just a business partner, but a soulmate who understood her completely. And Samuel Bridger, who'd thought himself dead in all the ways that mattered, had been resurrected by a woman brave enough to see past the savage exterior to the man beneath, giving him reasons to live rather than merely exist. Together, they'd proved that even in the harsh and unforgiving frontier, compassion could triumph over cruelty, love could conquer loneliness, and two broken people could create something whole and beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. The story of the Hartwell Ranch would be told and retold through generations, adapted and embellished by countless retellings. But the essential truth would remain: that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, that courage means standing firm when everything urges you to flee, and that the most powerful force on the frontier wasn't violence or wealth or political power, but the simple human capacity to see another's worth and fight to protect it. Eleanor and Samuel built more than a successful ranch. They built a life that honored the best possibilities of the American West, demonstrating that different peoples could work together, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that the wildness men feared could be transformed through compassion into strength that protected rather than destroyed. Their legacy endured long after their own story ended, inspiring others to choose courage over fear, connection over isolation, and love over the easier paths of bitterness and resignation. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.